You buried her 3 years ago, David. Lisa's voice trembled, her grip on the carved bassinet white-knuckled. I watched you put the earth over her casket. So, who was in your bed last night? David stood frozen in the doorway of their nursery, the scent of lavender and rain. Her scent, Sarah's scent, still clinging to his skin. The heavy oak doors of the royal suite felt like the walls of a tomb closing in. He looked at Lisa, his Luna, his steady harbor, and saw the jagged ruin he'd made of her trust. Lisa, he started, his voice a gravelly whisper. She didn't let him finish. She pressed a sealed envelope onto the pristine blanket of the empty cradle. Don't, she whispered, just read. The morning after the gala felt like waking up underwater. Alpha King David sat behind his mahogany desk, the sprawling metropolis of silver pines visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking like a hazy dream. He rubbed his temples, trying to massage away the rhythmic pounding in his skull. It wasn't a hangover from the amber liquid they'd served at the charity event. It was the echo of an impossibility. He had seen her. Not a ghost, not a trick of the light, but Sarah. Sarah, with her cascade of dark curls and that asymmetrical smile that always looked like she knew a secret joke. She had been wearing a dress the color of midnight, standing by the ice sculpture, looking at him with eyes that held the same terrifying intensity they had the night she died. He had followed her. Of course he had. He was an alpha. Instinct drove him before logic could intervene. Down a secluded hallway, into an empty coat room. The moment the door clicked shut, logic had vanished entirely. She had smelled of rain and lavender, a scent so deeply ingrained in his memory, it bypassed his brain and went straight to his heart. Or perhaps his guilt. David, she had whispered, pulling him into a desperate, frantic embrace. He hadn't asked how. He hadn't asked where she had been. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her warmth beneath his hands had drowned out every rational thought. It was a chaotic collision of grief, shock, and a desperate need to undo the past. When he woke up, the coat room was empty, save for the lingering scent of lavender and the chilling realization of what he had done. Now, hours later, the silence in his study was deafening. He stared at the security footage playing silently on his tablet. The camera outside the ballroom showed him leaving, alone. It showed him entering the hallway, alone. It showed him stumbling out of the coat room an hour later, looking like a man who had seen a ghost. There was no footage of a woman in a midnight dress. His intercom buzzed, the sharp sound making him flinch. "My king," his beta, Marcus, announced, his voice tight. "Luna Lisa is gone." David bolted upright, the chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "Gone? What do you mean, gone? She was in the nursery. The guards say she left through the private gardens an hour ago. She took a small bag. She left strict orders not to be followed." Marcus paused, the silence heavy. "She left something in the nursery for you." David was out the door before Marcus finished the sentence. The hallways of the royal residence were a blur of rich tapestries and polished marble. He didn't see any of it. His mind was a frantic loop of the morning's confrontation. "You buried her 3 years ago, David. So who was in your bed last night?" He burst into the nursery. The room was bathed in soft, morning light, painting the pale yellow walls in a warm glow. In the center, the intricately carved oak cradle sat empty. It was a family heirloom, waiting for the heir they had been trying so desperately to conceive. And there, resting precisely in the center of the pristine white blanket, was a sealed envelope. It bore his name, written in Lisa's elegant, sweeping script. Next to the envelope lay a small, velvet box. David's hands shook as he reached for the envelope. He broke the wax seal, the royal crest, stamped with chilling finality. David, I always knew I was the second choice. The quiet harbor after the storm. I accepted that because I loved you, and because I believed the storm was over. I thought we were building something real. But ghosts are greedy things. They don't just haunt the past. They devour the future. I know where you went last night. I don't know who she was. A trick, a hallucination, or some twisted reality I don't understand. But I know the look in your eyes when you returned. It was the look of a man who found what he lost and realized he didn't want what he had. I won't wait to be discarded. I won't raise a child in a home built on ashes. The box contains my wedding band and the confirmation of the pregnancy I was going to announce tonight. Do not look for me. Lisa. The air rushed from David's lungs as if he'd been struck. He dropped the letter and scrambled for the small velvet box. He flipped it open. Inside, nestled in black satin, lay the diamond ring he had placed on her finger 2 years ago, and a folded piece of paper, a positive ultrasound report. He was going to be a father, and he had just lost everything. The city of Silver Pines was a labyrinth of steel and glass, built over ancient pact territories. It was a modern kingdom, and David ruled it with a steady, if sometimes aloof, hand. But as he stood by the window of the empty nursery, the city felt like a foreign landscape. I want every camera within a 10-mile radius of the estate checked, David ordered, his voice raw, speaking into his comms unit. Train stations, airports, private airfields. Find her. David. Marcus's voice came through, hesitant. She's a Luna. She knows how to move unseen if she wants to. And if she's carrying an heir, her scent will be masked by the hormonal shifts. It's an old pack defense mechanism. David clenched his jaw, the muscle ticking erratically. I don't care about old mechanisms. Find my wife. He cut the connection and paced the length of the room. The scent of lavender still clung to his clothes, with a mocking reminder of his betrayal. How was it possible? He had seen Sarah's body. He had attended the funeral. He had felt the earth on his fingers. He needed answers. He needed to know what or who was in that coat room. He summoned the pack's lead investigator, a grizzled wolf named Elias, known for his meticulous, albeit slow, methods. I need you to look into the guest list from last night's gala, David said, handing Elias a tablet. Cross-reference it with the catering staff, the security detail, everyone who was in that building. I'm looking for a woman. Elias frowned, scrolling through the list. Description, my king? Dark hair, curly, about 5'6", wearing a dark blue or black dress. David hesitated, the words feeling like acid on his tongue. She looked exactly like Sarah. Elias looked up, his expression unreadable. Luna Sarah is dead, sire. I know that, Elias. But someone was there last night who looked like her. And they vanished without a trace on the cameras. Elias nodded slowly. I will begin immediately. But sire, if I may. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Grief can sometimes manifest in unusual ways. It wasn't grief, David snapped, his alpha aura flaring for a brief, uncontrolled second. The air in the room grew heavy, pushing Elias back a step. David immediately reined it in, running a hand over his face. Just find her. Find out who she is. As Elias left, David's phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered it cautiously. Alpha King. The voice was distorted, metallic, a synthetic hum that grated on his nerves. Who is this? Someone who knows what you lost, and someone who knows what you found. David's blood ran cold. Speak plainly. You want to know how the dead walk? You want to know why your Luna ran? The answers aren't in the city, David. They're where you buried your past. The line went dead. David stared at the phone. Where you buried your past? The old Pack Cemetery, located on the outskirts of the city, deep in the ancient woods. It was the place he hadn't visited since the day he laid Sarah to rest. He grabbed his coat. He was going to the cemetery, not as a grieving mate, but as a king seeking the truth. He drove himself, leaving Marcus and the guards behind. He needed to do this alone. The drive took an hour, the cityscape giving way to dense, towering pines. The road turned to dirt, winding its way up a steep incline until it reached the wrought iron gates of the cemetery. The air was cooler here, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. David walked down the familiar path, his heart hammering against his ribs. The graves of past alphas and pack members lined the walkway, silent sentinels watching his approach. He reached Sarah's plot. The headstone was simple, elegant marble, bearing her name and the date of her death. But something was wrong. The earth in front of the headstone was disturbed. Not freshly dug, but unsettled. The grass trampled and the soil turned over in jagged patches. David dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over the disturbed earth. His sharp senses, honed by his alpha blood, picked up a scent that made his stomach drop. It wasn't lavender. It was the sharp, metallic tang of sterile medical equipment, mixed with a very faint, almost undetectable undertone of decay. He dug into the loose soil with his bare hands, frantic, not knowing what he expected to find. A few inches down, his fingers hit something hard. Wood. He cleared the dirt away. The top of the casket was exposed, but it wasn't the pristine mahogany box he had chosen. The wood was splintered, the brass fittings tarnished and broken, and the lid was slightly ajar. David sat back on his heels, his breathing shallow and rapid. The silence of the cemetery was absolute, broken only by the harsh scraping of his own ragged exhales. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed the lid of the casket the rest of the way open. It was empty. No bones, no remnants of the dress she was buried in. Nothing. The silk lining was torn and stained, but the occupant was gone. A wave of nausea washed over him. He stumbled away from the grave, leaning heavily against a nearby oak tree. His mind reeled, trying to process the impossible. Grave robbers? A twisted prank? Or was the voice on the phone right? Did the dead walk? She didn't dig her way out, David. He spun around, instantly slipping into a defensive crouch, a low growl rumbling in his chest. A figure stood in the shadows of the trees, stepping slowly into the dappled sunlight. It was a man, older, with salt and pepper hair and a face lined with deep crevices. He wore a heavy wool coat despite the mild weather. David didn't recognize him, but the man carried an air of authority, a quiet intensity that demanded attention. "Who are you?" David demanded, his voice a dangerous rasp. "What do you know about this?" "My name is Dr. Aris Thorne," the man said calmly, making no aggressive moves. "And I know more about this than you can possibly imagine." David closed the distance between them in 3 strides, pinning Thorne against the tree. "Explain. Now." Thorne didn't flinch. He met David's gaze with disturbing serenity. "You buried a body, Alpha King. But you didn't bury Sarah." The woman in that casket died of a heart defect 3 days before your mate's accident. She was a match. Close enough in appearance, and with the right chemical manipulation, close enough in scent to fool a grieving, distracted alpha. You're lying. David's grip tightened on the man's coat. I saw her die. Her car went off the bridge. They pulled her body from the river. They pulled a body from the river, Thorne corrected. Sarah was intercepted before the crash. The accident was staged. Why? David roared, the sound echoing through the quiet woods. Why would anyone do that? Because she possessed something extremely valuable. A genetic anomaly. A recessive trait that only manifests once every few generations. Thorne's voice dropped to a near whisper. She had the blood of a true seer. David stared at him, his mind struggling to grasp the concepts. True seers were a myth, a bedtime story told to pups. Wolves who could see branching paths of the future, whose blood could allegedly heal mortal wounds. If this is a lie, David said, his voice deadly quiet, I will end you here and now. It is the truth, Thorne said, reaching into his pocket slowly. He pulled out a small silver locket. She dropped this in the laboratory. I kept it. David took the locket. It was Sarah's. He had given it to her on their first anniversary. He popped it open. The tiny picture of them smiling on a beach in Malibu was still inside. Where is she? David asked, his voice cracking. She was held in a facility off the grid. They extracted what they needed, synthesized her blood. They kept her in a chemically induced stasis for 3 years. Thorne paused. A flicker of something, regret, crossing his features. But 2 weeks ago, she woke up, and she escaped. So it was her last night. David whispered, the reality crashing down on him. The scent, the touch. It hadn't been a ghost. It had been his mate. Yes, she sought you out, instinct, Thorne said. But she is not the woman you remember, David. The experiments, the trauma. Her mind is fractured. She is dangerous, and the people who took her are hunting her. If they find her, they will kill her, and they will kill anyone who gets in their way. Then I need to find her first. You have a larger problem, Thorne said, looking toward the empty grave. The people hunting Sarah, they know about Lisa. They know she left the estate this morning. And they know she is carrying an heir. David's blood turned to ice. How do you know that? Because they intercepted a communication from your beta. Thorne's eyes darkened. They aren't just after Sarah anymore, David. They want the heir. They believe the child might carry the seer trait as well. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Lisa was out there, alone, vulnerable, carrying his child, being hunted by people who could stage a death and steal a body. Where is Lisa? David demanded, desperation edging his voice. Thorne shook his head. I don't know. But you have very little time to find out. The hunters are already closing in. David looked from the empty grave to the silver locket in his hand. He had a dead mate who was alive, a living mate who had run away, and an unborn child caught in the crossfire. He had to choose who to save. And he knew, with terrifying certainty, that whichever choice he made would cost him everything. The water in the rusted sink of the roadside motel ran brown for 3 seconds before clearing to a freezing, stinging transparency. Lisa splashed it over her face, scrubbing her skin until it was raw with a harsh, lye-based soap. It was an old rogue trick taught to her by her grandmother. It stripped the natural oils from the skin, and with it, the distinct, sweet scent of a Luna. She stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Her eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion and unshed tears. She looked nothing like the regal, composed woman who had stood beside Alpha King David for the past 2 years. She looked like prey. She placed a trembling hand over her flat stomach. The confirmation from the pack doctor was still folded in her pocket. A heavy, agonizing reminder of the future that had shattered in a single night. She had spent months tracking her temperature, taking vitamins, praying to the moon goddess for this exact miracle. And the night she was meant to tell him, he had come to their quarters reeking of the one woman Lisa could never compete with. A ghost. A memory. Lisa turned away from the mirror, her chest tightening with a sob she refused to release. She couldn't afford grief right now. She packed her meager belongings into a duffel bag. She had ditched her royal SUV 3 towns back, trading it for a beat-up sedan paid for in cash. She was heading north, toward the jagged peaks of the Blackwood Ridge. There was an old, abandoned hunting cabin there that her father had used decades ago. It wasn't on any royal registry. It was her only chance to disappear, miles away. Standing in the dense pines of the cemetery, David crushed his royal comms unit beneath the heel of his boot. Dr. Thorne watched him, his expression unreadable. A wise decision, King David. They are monitoring your secure frequencies. Who are they? David demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He felt a frantic, clawing panic rising in his chest, a primal urge to shift and run, to tear apart the city until he found his mate. A private syndicate, Thorne replied, adjusting his heavy coat. They deal in genetic anomalies, rare bloodlines, things the supernatural community prefers to keep hidden. They have resources that rival your own. You cannot use your pack to find Lisa. A massive mobilization will only lead the hunters straight to her. David knew Thorne was right. If Marcus's communications were compromised, the entire palace network was compromised. He had to operate outside the system. He turned away from the empty grave, the silver locket burning a hole in his pocket. "Where will you go?" Thorne asked. "To find a ghost of my own," David muttered, striding toward his car. He drove to the edge of the city, navigating the labyrinthine streets of the industrial district until he reached a dilapidated mechanic's garage. The metal door was half open, the smell of motor oil and stale beer rolling out into the afternoon air. "Silas," David called out, stepping into the gloom. A man slid out from beneath a rusted pickup truck on a crawler. He was covered in grease, a jagged scar running from his jaw to his collarbone. A gift from a rogue wolf David had executed years ago. Silas was a tracker, a wolf who had rejected pack politics to live on the fringes. He owed David his life. Silas wiped his hands on a filthy rag, his pale eyes narrowing as he took in David's appearance. "You look like hell, King. And you're alone. That's a bad combination. I need you to find someone, off the books, no pack channels." "Who? Lisa?" Silas raised an eyebrow. "Your Luna? Did she finally get tired of the palace?" "It's complicated," David snapped. "She's running, and there are people hunting her, professionals. I need you to find her trail before they do." Silas tossed the rag aside, his demeanor shifting instantly to business. What was she driving? A black SUV, palace plates. But she's smart. She'll ditch it. David paced the concrete floor. He closed his eyes, trying to think like Lisa. Where would she go? She wouldn't go to her friends. She knew he would check there. She wouldn't stay in the city. She has an old family property, David said, his eyes snapping open. Blackwood Ridge, an old hunting cabin. It's remote, off the grid. She mentioned it once, years ago. Silas grabbed a leather jacket from a peg on the wall. Blackwood Ridge is a 4-hour drive. If she left this morning, she's already there. Let's move. The drive north was a torment of silence. Rain began to fall as they left the city limits, a relentless downpour that mirrored the icy dread settling in David's stomach. Silas drove a modified, unmarked truck that roared over the slick asphalt. David's mind was a chaotic battleground. He thought of Lisa, alone and terrified, carrying his child. And then, unbidden, the memory of the coat room rushed back. The frantic, desperate grip of Sarah's hands on his face. The overwhelming scent of lavender and rain that had bypassed every logical filter in his brain. Thorne had said she sought him out on instinct. She hadn't been the woman he loved, returning for a romantic reunion. She had been a traumatized, fractured prisoner, seeking the only safe harbor her broken mind could remember. Her alpha. And he, blinded by grief and a 3-year-old scent, had taken her in his arms. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing his lungs. "Our tire tracks," Silas said abruptly, breaking the silence. He slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the muddy forest road. They were an hour into the dense woods of Blackwood Ridge. David leaned forward. The headlights illuminated deep ruts in the mud, veering sharply off the road and disappearing into a thicket of pine trees. "Those are fresh," Silas noted, grabbing a heavy tactical flashlight. "And they're too wide for a standard sedan. That's a heavy-duty vehicle." David's heart hammered against his ribs. The hunters. They exited the truck, moving silently into the trees. The rain masked their scent and muffled their footsteps. 50 yards in, they found it. A matte black tactical SUV had slammed headfirst into a massive oak tree. The engine was smoking, hissing as the rain hit the hot metal. Silas drew a sidearm, sweeping the area. David let his claws extend, his senses flaring. The metallic tang of blood cut through the smell of pine and ozone. 3 men in dark combat gear lay scattered around the vehicle. David approached the nearest one. His throat had been torn open, the lacerations jagged and brutal. It wasn't the clean kill of a trained soldier. It was the desperate, feral work of a panicked animal. "Who did this?" Silas whispered, checking the pulse of a second man whose chest plate had been crushed inward. "A bear?" "No," David breathed, his gaze locking onto a shred of fabric caught on a nearby branch. It was dark blue silk, soaked in rain and blood. The color of midnight. A low, guttural snarl echoed from the canopy above. David snapped his head up. Crouched on a thick branch, half hidden by the shadows and rain, was a figure. "Sarah," David whispered. She dropped to the forest floor with a heavy thud, landing in a defensive crouch. She was unrecognizable from the elegant woman at the gala. Her midnight dress was torn to rags, clinging to her emaciated frame. She was covered in mud and blood. But it was her eyes that shattered David's heart. They were wild, dilated pools of absolute terror. There was no recognition in them, no warmth. She was a cornered, feral creature. "David, step back," Silas warned, raising his weapon. "That's not a rational wolf." "Put it down, Silas," David ordered, his voice trembling. He took a slow, agonizing step forward, keeping his hands visible. "Sarah, it's me." She bared her teeth, a horrifying, inhuman sound tearing from her throat. She scrambled backward, hitting the side of the wrecked SUV. She clutched her head, her fingers tearing at her dark curls as if trying to rip thoughts from her skull. "Alpha," she whimpered, the word distorted, broken. Hurts. The lights. The needles. I know, David said softly, tears mixing with the rain on his face. He stripped off his heavy coat and held it out. No more needles? You're safe now. She looked at the coat, then at him. The scent of him, her alpha, seemed to break through the fog of her trauma for a fleeting second. She lunged forward, not to attack, but to collapse against his chest. She was freezing, her body racked with violent tremors. David wrapped the coat around her, holding her tightly. She didn't feel like his lost mate. She felt like a broken bird. The reality of what Thorne had said fully materialized. The woman he loved had died 3 years ago. The syndicate had merely kept her body alive to harvest her blood. We can't stay here, Silas said urgently, keeping his eyes on the tree line. If this was an advance team, the rest aren't far behind. We have to move. David scooped Sarah into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. He looked up the winding mountain road, toward the peak where Lisa's cabin lay. Silas, take her, David said, his voice hardening into absolute resolve. Take her back to your garage. Lock her in the reinforced vault. Keep her safe. What about you? I have to get to my wife. The cabin was exactly as Lisa remembered it. A sturdy, weathered structure built from heavy logs, perched on the edge of a steep ravine. It was isolated, silent, and cold. She had spent the last 2 hours boarding up the windows from the inside and gathering whatever dry firewood she could find. She sat on a dusty armchair in the center of the main room, a heavy wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Across her lap lay her father's antique hunting rifle, loaded with silver-tipped rounds. She hadn't lit a fire. Smoke would be a beacon. She sat in the deepening gloom, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain on the tin roof. Every creak of the timber, every rustle of the wind sent a spike of adrenaline through her veins. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the porch, wood splintering under a heavy boot. Lisa stood up instantly, the blanket falling away. She raised the rifle, her finger hovering over the trigger, aiming the barrel squarely at the heavy oak door. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Lisa, a voice called out, muffled by the thick wood. Her breath hitched. David. Go away, she screamed, her voice cracking. I told you not to follow me. Lisa, please, open the door. You are in danger. The only danger to me is you, she yelled back, tears springing to her eyes. Go back to your ghost, David. Leave me alone. She's not a ghost, Lisa, and it's not what you think. The desperation in his voice was raw, frantic. Please, they are coming for you. They are coming for the baby. The mention of the baby made her freeze. How did he know? She hadn't told anyone but the doctor and the note she left. Open the door or I'm breaking it down, David warned. Before she could process the threat, the heavy oak door groaned and shattered inward, the lock completely giving way under his unnatural strength. David stumbled into the room, drenched in rain, his shirt torn and stained with mud. Lisa didn't lower the rifle. Take one more step, David, and I swear to the goddess I will shoot you. David stopped, raising his hands. He looked ragged, wild. Shoot me later. Right now we have to go. There is a syndicate of hunters sweeping this mountain. They staged Sarah's death. They kept her in a lab for 3 years. She escaped, and she sought me out last night. I didn't know, Lisa. I swear to you, I didn't know. Lisa stared at him, the rifle trembling in her hands. It sounded insane. It sounded like the desperate lie of a cornered man. You expect me to believe that? I don't care if you believe me, David roared, stepping forward until the barrel of the rifle pressed directly against his chest. I care that you stay alive. They know about the baby. They think the child might carry her genetic traits because of my bloodline. They want our child, Lisa. The absolute conviction in his eyes made her falter. The anger in his gaze wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the world. You chose her, Lisa whispered, the betrayal still a raw, bleeding wound in her chest. I chose a phantom memory, David said, his voice breaking. He didn't pull away from the gun. I made a catastrophic mistake out of grief. But she isn't my mate anymore, Lisa. She is a broken, feral victim of a nightmare. You are my Luna. You are my future. And I will burn this entire mountain down before I let them touch you. Before Lisa could respond, a sharp, metallic ping echoed through the cabin. A small, cylindrical object smashed through the boarded-up window to their left, rolling across the floorboards and emitting a high-pitched whine. David's eyes widened. Flashbang! Close your eyes! He lunged forward, tackling Lisa to the floor just as the cabin erupted in a blinding, deafening explosion of white light and sound. The shockwave rattled Lisa's teeth, the ringing in her ears instantly drowning out the sound of the rain. David's heavy body shielded hers from the flying wood and glass. Through the ringing, the sound of heavy boots hitting the porch reverberated through the floorboards. Red laser sights cut through the smoke and dust filling the room, sweeping across the walls like predatory insects. The hunters had arrived. The white-hot brilliance of the flashbang seared through Lisa's tightly shut eyelids, leaving jagged afterimages burning in her retinas. The concussive wave stole the breath from her lungs, turning the world into a high-pitched, ringing void. Through the sensory whiteout, she felt the crushing, protective weight of David's body shielding hers. Heavy debris rained down on his broad back as the front windows shattered completely, the barricaded boards blown inward like toothpicks. The ringing in her ears slowly morphed into the rhythmic, terrifying crunch of tactical boots on splintered wood. The hunters were inside. David moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that defied human physics. 1 second he was covering her, and the next he launched himself into the smoke-filled room. A primal, earth-shaking roar tore from his chest, a sound that resonated in Lisa's very bones. The alpha had been unleashed. Lisa scrambled backward, her vision swimming as she grasped the smooth, polished wood of her father's rifle. She dragged herself behind the overturned, heavy oak table. Through the billowing gray smoke and the frantic red beams of laser sights, she watched a nightmare unfold. 3 men in heavy, dark Kevlar advanced, assault rifles raised. But David was already among them. He didn't fully shift, there wasn't room, and it would leave him vulnerable to concentrated fire. Instead, he relied on the raw, brute strength of his bloodline. He caught the barrel of the first hunter's rifle, crushing the steel casing with his bare hand and violently ripping it away. In the same motion, he drove his elbow into the man's chest plate, the sickening crack of ribs audible even over the rain. "Contact left!" the second hunter shouted, swinging his weapon toward David. Lisa didn't think. Instinct, sharp and protective, took over. She hoisted the heavy rifle, resting the barrel on the edge of the overturned table. She aligned the iron sights with the dark mass of the second hunter's vest. She pulled the trigger. The recoil punched into her shoulder like a hammer, snapping her teeth together. The thunderous boom of the antique rifle momentarily deafened her again. A silver-tipped round, designed to take down rogue bears, punched through the hunter's side armor, sending him crashing into the stone fireplace. David didn't pause to see where the shot came from. He used the distraction to close the gap on the third man, sweeping his legs out from under him and neutralizing him with a brutal strike to the jaw. For 3 seconds, The cabin was silent, except for the hissing of the rain blowing through the ruined windows and the heavy, ragged breathing of the Alpha. "Are you hit?" David demanded, his eyes glowing a faint, luminescent gold as he rushed to Lisa's side. He scanned her frantically, his hands hovering over her frame, terrified to touch her in case she was broken. "I'm fine," she gasped, her shoulder throbbing. She looked at the bodies on the floor, then at him. His white shirt was soaked in rain, dirt, and blood, though whether it was his or theirs, she couldn't tell. "That was the breach team," David said, his voice a low, urgent rumble. He grabbed the rifle from her trembling hands and effortlessly racked the bolt, chambering another round. "There will be more outside. We can't hold this structure." "There's a root cellar," Lisa said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. She pointed toward a ragged rug near the small kitchenette. "My father built a drainage tunnel that leads out to the ravine. It's narrow, but it exits 50 yards down the ridge." "Move," David ordered. Automatic gunfire erupted from the tree line, chewing through the log walls of the cabin. Splinters the size of daggers flew through the air. David threw himself over Lisa again, sheltering her as they crawled across the floorboards toward the rug. Lisa shoved the heavy wool rug aside, her fingers scrambling to find the recessed iron ring in the floor. She yanked it upward. A wave of musty, damp air rolled out from the darkness below. "Go!" David yelled over the deafening roar of gunfire. "I'm right behind you." Lisa slid feet first into the black abyss, hitting the soft dirt floor of the cellar. A second later, David dropped down beside her, pulling the heavy wooden trapdoor shut. Just as a fresh volley of bullets ripped through the floorboards where they had been seconds before. They plunged into absolute darkness, the sounds of the siege above them instantly muffled by 3 feet of earth and timber. The drainage tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare of mud, exposed roots, and freezing water. Lisa crawled on her hands and knees, the cold seeping through her jeans and biting into her skin. David was close behind her, his alpha aura pushing back the stifling panic that threatened to overwhelm her. They emerged into the freezing downpour 20 minutes later, sliding down a steep, muddy embankment into the dense thicket of the ravine. The cabin was a faint, burning glow through the canopy high above them. The hunters had set it on fire. Lisa collapsed against the trunk of a massive pine, her chest heaving, her legs trembling violently from exhaustion and adrenaline. The reality of her pregnancy hit her in a wave of protective terror. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, shivering uncontrollably. David knelt beside her. He stripped off his ruined outer shirt, leaving him in a soaked undershirt, and wrapped the relatively dry garment around her shoulders. He pulled her against his chest, transferring his unnaturally high body heat to her freezing frame. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain and their synchronized, ragged breathing. "You shot him," David whispered, his chin resting on the top of her head. There was a profound sense of awe in his voice. "To protect me." Lisa closed her eyes, letting the warmth of him seep into her bones. The anger was still there, but it was dulled, overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of what they were facing. "You threw yourself over a flashbang for me," she murmured. She pulled back slightly, forcing herself to meet his gaze in the gloom. The golden glow in his eyes had faded, leaving only the dark, tormented brown she knew so well. "David," she started, her voice breaking. "If she hadn't been fractured, if the woman in that coat room had been the Sarah you lost, whole and sane, would you be here right now?" David didn't look away. He didn't flinch from the jagged edge of the question. He reached up, gently wiping a streak of mud from her cheek with his thumb. "When I held her in that room," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the rain, I wasn't holding my future. I was holding my grief. I was holding the guilt of failing her 3 years ago. It blinded me. It made me stupid and weak. He took her cold hands in his. But she is a memory, Lisa. A tragic, horrific memory. You are the air in my lungs. You are the Luna of my pack and the mother of my child. Even if she were whole, my place is beside you. It has always been you. Since the day I put that ring on your finger. I needed to bury the ghost, to finally see it. A tear slipped down Lisa's cheek, mingling with the rain. For the first time in 24 hours, she felt the crushing weight on her chest begin to ease. Before she could answer, a sharp, static crackle erupted from David's hip. His salvaged Royal Comms unit, which he had clipped to his belt, sputtered to life. The encryption was broken, the signal weak. Alpha. The voice was faint, choked with static and pain. It was Silas. David snatched the unit. Silas, sitrep, is Sarah secure? It was a trap, King. Silas gasped, the sound of heavy boots echoing in the background of the transmission. The garage. Breached. They knew the codes. Who knew the codes? David demanded, his grip on the plastic device whitening his knuckles. The doctor. Silas coughed, a wet, horrifying sound. Thorn. He didn't want to protect her, David. He wanted her back. He used you. To track her. And to flush out the Luna. The line went dead. David stared at the radio, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Thorn hadn't been a neutral observer or a savior. Thorn was the head of the syndicate. He had manipulated David at the cemetery, feeding him just enough truth to panic him. Thorn knew David would lead them straight to Lisa. He wanted the seer, and he wanted the unborn heir. David? Lisa asked, seeing the blood drain from his face. It's Thorn, David snarled, his fangs elongating as pure, unadulterated rage flooded his veins. He's the one hunting us. Suddenly, the roar of a heavy engine echoed from the logging road at the bottom of the ravine. Blinding headlights cut through the trees, illuminating the rain. A convoy of 3 armored black SUVs had blocked the only exit from the mountain. A megaphone crackled to life over the sound of the idling engines. Alpha King. Thorn's calm, cultured voice drifted up through the trees. There is nowhere left to run. Bring down the Luna. Bring down the child. And perhaps I will let you live to see tomorrow. The rain lashed against them as they stood on the ridge overlooking the blockade. There were at least a dozen mercenaries spread out among the vehicles, heavily armed and scanning the tree line with thermal optics. Thorn stood safely behind the open door of the center SUV, wearing the same heavy wool coat he had worn at the cemetery. We can't fight an army, David, Lisa whispered, her grip tightening on the empty rifle. We don't have to, David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He unclipped his comms unit and crushed it in his hand, dropping the plastic shards into the mud. I just have to kill the snake. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, possessive fire. Stay here, in the shadows. Do not move until I tell you. No, Lisa said firmly, grabbing his arm. We are a pack. I am not hiding in the dirt while you die for me. David looked at her, seeing the absolute resolve in her eyes. She wasn't the quiet, agreeable who stood in his shadow at galas. She was a Luna, forged in the fires of betrayal and survival. Then keep your head down, he said, pressing a swift, desperate kiss to her forehead. And when I make an opening, you run for the trees on the far side of the road. David didn't wait for a response. He turned and stepped out from the cover of the thicket, walking openly down the muddy embankment toward the headlights. "Hold your fire." Thorne's voice echoed through the megaphone. "Let him approach." David walked until he was 30 yards from the vehicles. The mercenaries tightened their grips on their weapons, unnerved by the sheer predatory confidence radiating from the lone, unarmed man. "Where is she, David?" Thorne asked, stepping out slightly from behind the door. "Genetic protein requires sacrifice. Your child is the key to unlocking the true potential of the seer bloodline. Hand her over, and you can return to your throne." "You made a mistake, Thorne," David rumbled, his voice carrying effortlessly over the rain. "And what is that?" "You came into my territory, and you threatened my mate." David didn't move. He simply let the suppression of his alpha aura drop completely. It hit the human mercenaries like a physical shockwave. It was an invisible, suffocating weight. The primal, instinctual terror of a supreme apex predator. Several men gasped, stumbling backward, their hands shaking so violently they dropped their weapons. Their human brains were suddenly screaming at them to flee, to submit, to survive. In that split second of paralyzed terror, David moved. He lunged forward, closing the distance to the first SUV before the mercenaries could even raise their rifles. He slammed into the vehicle, the sheer force of the impact sending it sliding sideways in the mud, crushing two of the hunters beneath it. Gunfire erupted, erratic and panicked. David ducked under the hail of bullets, using the vehicles as cover. He was a shadow, a blur of lethal precision, incapacitating the men with bone-breaking efficiency. Thorne, his calm facade shattering, pulled a heavy-caliber handgun from his coat. He wildly searched the chaos for a target. Through the smoke and rain, he spotted movement on the embankment. Lisa. She was moving toward the far trees, just as David had instructed. Thorne raised his weapon, aiming directly at her back. "If I can't have the child," he screamed, "neither can you." "No," David roared. He threw himself across the hood of the center SUV, placing himself directly in Thorne's line of sight. The gunshot was deafening. The heavy slug caught David high in the left shoulder, the kinetic force spinning him around and dropping him to the mud. Lisa screamed his name, freezing in her tracks. She watched as Thorne stepped forward, a triumphant sneer on his face, racking the slide of his handgun to finish the Alpha King. Lisa didn't run. She dropped to one knee in the mud, raising the heavy, empty antique rifle to her shoulder. She didn't have a bullet, but Thorne didn't know that. She took aim, her eyes locked on Thorne's chest, and let out a vicious, feral scream that echoed with all the fury of a Luna defending her mate. Thorne hesitated, his eyes darting to the barrel of the rifle pointed at his heart. He instinctively flinched, stepping backward. That single second of hesitation was all David needed. Ignoring the agony in his shoulder, David swept his good leg out, catching Thorne's ankles. The doctor hit the mud hard, the gun flying from his grasp. Before Thorne could recover, David's heavy boot came down on his wrist, shattering the bones. The remaining mercenaries, seeing their leader broken and the Alpha rising from the mud with glowing, murderous eyes, broke and ran into the woods. Suddenly, the wail of sirens pierced the night air. Headlights flooded the logging road from the south. A fleet of armored vehicles bearing the crest of Silver Pines roared onto the scene. Elias, the grizzled lead investigator, stepped out of the lead car, surrounded by heavily armed pack enforcers. He had followed the breadcrumbs. David swayed on his feet, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He looked past the arriving reinforcements, his eyes searching frantically. Lisa was already running to him. She slammed into his chest, her arms wrapping around his waist, burying her face against his uninjured side. David held her tightly with his good arm, burying his face in her wet hair. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood and the mud. But the scent of lavender was entirely gone. All David could smell was rain, pine, and the sweet, comforting scent of his Luna. The ghost was finally buried, and their future had just begun. The storm eventually broke, leaving behind a sky washed clean and the promise of a quiet dawn. The shadows of the past had tried to consume them, but Alpha King David and Luna Lisa emerged from the darkness forged in fire and absolute loyalty. The cradle in the nursery would no longer sit empty, a monument to betrayal, but would soon hold the legacy of a love that survived the ultimate test. They had faced the ghosts of yesterday, and together they had chosen tomorrow. Thank you for reading. After his one-night affair with the lover he thought was dead, his Luna left a sealed cradle. If you enjoyed this journey of betrayal, suspense, and ultimate redemption, please share this story with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling Alpha King romance fiction.